Let the Lord lead us. Anyway, I wanted to
Go ahead.
talk about that letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association on October the 7th, 1801. This was following his election to the presidency of that same year. In their letter, the Baptists congratulated Jefferson on his election and then proceeded to express their concern that as a minor part of the state, that the religious liberties they enjoyed, let's see, here it is, yeah. Said Thomas Jefferson was a man of deep religious conviction. His conviction was that religion was a very personal matter, one which the government had no business getting involved in. He was vilified by his political opponents for his role in the passage of the 1786 Virginia Statute for religious freedom and for his criticism of such biblical events as the Great Flood and the theological age of the earth. As president, he discontinued the practice started by his predecessors, George Washington and John Adams, of proclaiming days of fasting and Thanksgiving. Goes on here. He was a staunch believer in the separation of church and state. Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1802 to answer a letter from them written in October 1801. A copy of the Danbury letter is available. The Danbury Baptists were a religious minority in Connecticut, and they complained that in their state the religious liberties they enjoyed were not seen as immutable rights, but as privileges granted by the legislature, as favors granted. Jefferson's reply did not address their concerns about problems with state establishment of religion, only of establishment on the national level. The letter contains the phrase, quote, wall of separation between church and state, unquote, which led to the shorthand for the establishment clause that we use today, quote, separation of church and state, unquote. However, that is not in the Constitution.
That's right.
This was the only place where it was mentioned and that it was ever brought up. But then you talk to the average citizen today and they'll argue with you, well, that's in the Constitution, separation of church state. A lot of the politicians, they've made an issue of it. That it's definitely part of the Constitution.
It's not.
But it's not. But the letter was the subject of intense scrutiny by Jefferson. He consulted a couple of New England politicians to assure that his words would not offend while still conveying his message. It was not the place of the Congress or the executive to do things that might be misconstrued as the establishment of religion. The bracketed section in the second paragraph here had been blocked off for the deletion in the final draft of the letter sent to the Danbury Baptist, though it was not actually deleted in Jefferson's draft of the letter. It is included here for completeness, reflecting upon his knowledge that the letter was far from a mere personal correspondence. Jefferson deleted the block, he noted in the margin, to avoid offending members of his party in the eastern state. Politics, afraid it might offend somebody, but his predecessors, like it said, they were very religious men, are very men of faith. Let's call them men of faith. Anybody could be religious.
That's right.
What is religion?
Yeah, Washington and Adams were very,
Yeah,
they were
religion's
devout.
man-made anyway, so.
Yeah. They were devout. They honored Christ. They believed in Christ.
Yeah.
Jefferson is a different. We discussed that earlier, that Jefferson, he admired Jesus, but he did not believe in any of the miracles that he did.
Right. He did.
He just believed he was a good moral man, that we should, try to be like him as far as our morals. Although Jefferson was somewhat of a poor example.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that he did, in his personal life.
Right.
But he believed that we should at least strive to live the morals of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But he did not believe that Jesus was, he definitely didn't believe he was the Son of God. Did not believe that he was the Savior of the world. Did not believe that any of his miracles that he did while he was here on the earth. And he was, what we call a deist. And a deist was a person who sort of believed that God had just created everything kind of like a watch. He'd set everything in motion, and then he kind of went his own way. And he did not interfere in the affairs of men at all. He didn't really care what man did.
Yeah.
He didn't want to intervene with man. He just kind of let man do his own thing, and therefore he wouldn't. Miracles and all that would be impossible, because if God didn't, if God wasn't involved with His creation, then miracles would be impossible.
Yeah.
And that's what the deists believed.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So, and that's what Thomas Jefferson was. Now, some people believe that pretty much all the founders were deists, but that's not quite true. Only some of them. There were many of them that were very devout Christians. And
Many of them were.
As you read their writings and everything, you'll find that out.
Many of the ones that signed the Declaration of Independence were ministers.
Yes, that's right. They were. Yes.
And
yes, many of them were ministers.
Practically all of them had a good education.
Yeah.
I think. So they weren't like poor, dumb farmers.
No.
Or anything like that.
Yeah.
They were well known in the community and were respected, and many of them had businesses or big farms, And
John Adams had a big farm. So did George Washington.
some of them did have slaves.
Yes.
Even
that's true.
George Washington.
Yeah.
But they were concerned about correcting
the slavery thing. They knew eventually it was going to be a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, they were more concerned about the independence of the United States and us establishing a nation.
Well, when you use the word slavery, most people get the wrong interpretation of it right away. They think, there's somebody beating the back of a black man, with a whip, all the time. Most of those so-called slaves were actually like servants. They worked voluntarily, and many of them got wages for what they done. And many of them stayed even when the Civil War came along and they were liberated. Declaration of
something they don't, a lot of people don't realize is there were black plantation owners.
Oh, yeah, there were. Yeah.
That had black slaves.
Yeah.
Working for them.
Right.
And they were, they were black people themselves.
Yeah.
Black plantation owners.
Yeah.
That had blacks working for them as slaves.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just white people that had black people as slaves. There were black
And just
people.
because it ended in America, slavery, does not mean it ended all over the world.
Yeah.
It was still...
it ended in England before, it was a big thing in England, if you remember. A guy made him a Wilberforce, and there was some others that were, William Force pretty much spent his entire life. And sort of, John Wesley, the great Methodist preacher, encouraged Wilberforce to keep working in his endeavors to end slavery in England. And
the Hollywood actor Clark Gable. I think
yes.
I think he starred in that
Gone
movie,
with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind.
Yes.
And there's a session in there when the slaves were freed, and many of the southern plantation owners that had several slaves that worked there worked with them, and many of them, when they got their freedom, they didn't know what to do, because that's all the life they knew.
Yes.
And many of them were treated much better before that declaration that ended slavery than afterwards. Afterwards, it was a change in their life completely.
Yeah.
Many of them didn't know what to do. They were jobless. They were homeless.
Yes.
And many of them chose, though, to stay with the plantation owner or their so-called owner of slavery, but even though they were not slaves anymore. and many of them decided, you know, it's better for me to just stay with the man that I've been serving for all these years. And many of them were treated well. Now there were some examples of some people being whipped and all that kind of stuff, but a lot of that came after the Civil War. If you want to look that up, a lot of it came afterwards because they were persecuted quite a bit more
Yes.
after the Civil War,
And that's very
because
sad.
of that declaration.
Yeah. It's very sad.
Yeah, and it wasn't most of that wasn't coming from the South or the plantation owners or those, because those people were like family, you know, and they worked together and they loved their job and they served willfully. But most people get all blown up out of shape, you know, when you mention the word slavery, you know, but and people can take that too far and carry that too far. But yes, it has been eliminated, and it's been for over 150 years now.
Well, you know, a lot of people think that the Bible condones slavery. Well, it really doesn't.
No.
In fact, if you remember right, the Jewish people were slaves
Right.
for, you know, hundreds of years in
Over
Egypt.
400 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And because they were slaves,
Yeah.
and they actually had slaves when they came out of Egypt. But remember what God had told them. They were to release on what we call the year of Jubilee.
Yeah. Right.
Everything was to be released. All debts,
All debts.
all slaves, everything was to be released.
Right.
Now here's what happened. If a person wanted to be a slave, continue to be a
They
slave,
had to be,
they would take an awl and
Yeah.
they would put it through his
They had to put a-
through his right ear.
so they could put a ring in
And
their
that
ear.
meant that he was going to be a slave
Right.
for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
But he voluntarily
He
did
chose
that.
to do that.
He chose to do that. He wasn't under
Yeah.
obligation.
Right.
So he chose to do that.
Yeah.
And you know, people say, well, how about how about the New Testament with Apostle Paul
Yeah.
when he writes to Philemon, you
Yeah.
know, about Onesimus. But Paul tells him, you know, to treat, you know, Onesimus had apparently had run away, and you know, Paul's writing this letter and everything, but Paul nowhere does Paul condone slavery.
No. No.
Like you said, a lot of these slaves,
Yeah.
after they were set free, they really didn't know what to do,
No.
and so they had
Most of them didn't have any skills.
no, they didn't have any skills, and they had no education. They had nothing that they could really do
Yeah.
because they were tied. Their whole life had been tied to a certain thing.
Right.
It was like the Israelites in Egypt.
Yeah.
You know, when they started building everything for the Egyptians, they really didn't have very many rights. I mean, the Egyptians even made it harder for them. You remember there toward the very end. You know, they said, now you're even going to have to start making the bricks. You're
Yeah.
going to have to start doing the straw. You know, you have to start doing all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. We're going to make it harder on you
Right.
than you had before.
Now, even during the time of slavery, before the Civil War, there were free black men and families. Some of them very devout businessmen and very wise and smart. I don't know what the years that his last name was Washington. He was a black man. He invented
Yes,
so many things.
Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington. He was actually the inventor of paint, and he used. Gosh, I'd have to look all that stuff up, but
George Washington Carver was another
Yeah.
one.
yeah,
I think he's the one that found all the uses for a peanut.
peanuts. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were both
yeah.
very smart
He
men.
found many uses for.
In fact, if I remember right, there was a black person that actually helped design Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't remember the name right now,
Yeah,
but very, very smart. You had people in the north part of the
Yeah.
United States that were blacks.
yeah,
Of course, they were free.
of course.
They had, you know, there was no slavery there.
Right.
So to say that all the blacks in America were slaves,
No, they weren't.
you know, that the white people held all the blacks, you know, in the United States as slaves.
Right.
You had people living in the West part of the United States.
Yeah.
They didn't have black slaves.
No.
White people, you know, white people. I mean, you know, my ancestry is is from the western part of the United States. We didn't have slaves. Of course, we're obviously white. So when you start talking about all the white people in the United States,
yeah. Well, some of them
all had slaves.
Some of them in the West had slaves, had Chinese slaves.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And in fact, they brought them over and promised them liberty, promised them be citizenship. They brought them over from China to help build that railroad. And they were hard workers, you know. And
Yeah.
many of them never got citizenship.
That's right.
You know,
Yeah.
they were lied to, but
Yeah.
there was all kinds of different foreigners that come.
And there were a lot of Mexicans.
Yeah.
That lived in the western part of the United
Right.
States, and obviously they didn't have slaves.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of people in the United States that didn't have slaves. So you know it's I mean people say, well, the whole United States was slavery. No, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
It was only a small section of the United States.
Well, there was other countries, and some of them for years after that, maybe 100 years after that, were still using slaves and owned them. Jamaica, so it's a good example of it. And in fact, I could go on with some stories about that, but look it up in history.
Jamaica.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's have a coffee break and we'll get
Yeah,
back
okay.
to this.